So let me just go through this. Matt Stoller tweeted this out today. He says, unlike the Small Business Administration program of $350 billion, the Fed has an unlimited amount of money and it has zero accountability. The Fed generates massive inequality when it organizes monetary policy through the Cantillon effect. So please tell people what the Cantillon effect is and how that manifests inequality.
So very simply, it's the what it's referring to is the phenomenon of a bunch of new money is being given to some group of people. And let's say it's just the three of us, you, me, and Steph. Whoever gets that money first, let's say Steph gets all the money first, and you and I have to wait a year or 6 months to get it. The person who gets the money first has a huge advantage in terms of exploiting the low prices from the crisis while the rest of the world waits for money to arrive. And so what Matt's talking about with the Cantillon effect is he's talking about the dynamic where the Federal Reserve is giving the private equity firms and the big banks that pile of money so that they can run around the economy for the next 3 to 6 months buying and doing whatever they want, while the rest of the economy waits for that money to arrive. And while the first person to get the money gets the advantage of all the low prices in the economy, the last person to get any money, by the time they even get the money, all the prices are back to being very expensive again anyway. So the value of the money, basically what it's referring to is a lot of money now, when prices are cheap, is much more valuable than a little bit of money later when prices are higher.
Right. So that's the Cantillon. So the people who are most favored by the Fed and Steve Mnuchin are going to be getting their money first. And so when prices of all assets in America, meaning whatever that asset is, whether it be
houses, companies, bonds,
property, whatever, they'll be at their lowest. And then the government gives money to the richest people. They could buy all that assets in America at fire sale prices. And then the people who get their money the last will be getting their money, but all the prices will have been reinflated. So they really get that big of an advantage.
Exactly.
And that, right.
That's right.
So
you sound like a Harvard economist.
So the Fed, so Matt Stoller goes on and he says the Fed is also a destabilizing force in the world and undermines our position vis-a-vis China. The Fed's goal is to support the massively indebted, dangerous business model of private equity, all in secret. Can you talk to that? Can you speak to that?
I mean, what has happened is a huge amount of the investment in American companies. So if you're a shoe company or you're a movie theater company or you're an auto parts company or whatever it may be, a huge percentage of the investment in those medium-sized and large companies, big auto parts companies, big shoe manufacturer, big movie theater company, those investments have moved over the past 10, 20 years to be controlled by so-called private equity firms. So instead of being publicly traded in the stock market or instead of being invested in directly by pension funds like CalPERS, the teacher's pension in California or the police in New York or in Illinois or wherever, what's happened is the core investor has been these private equity groups, and these private equity groups then use the leverage of their ownership of all of these core American businesses to demand support and bailouts from the Federal Reserve whenever there's economic distress. So this is what happened in 2009 and 10 or 8 and 9, and then is repeating itself right now.
How is that a destabilizing force?
Because it creates a dynamic where you have massive removal of economic opportunity from huge percentages of the country while creating a huge amount of power and money with a really small group of people. And anytime that you accelerate the movement of money towards one small group of people and then take vast sums of it away from huge groups of people, it's by definition politically destabilizing.
Right. Okay, I got you. Okay, that makes sense. So, right. So while everyone else's assets are falling and they're losing their wealth, there's a small group of people who are connected to the Fed and the Treasury who are getting a ton of trillions in wealth, and so that's going to make the inequality even bigger in a consolidation of already power, monetary power.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
So let's move on.
Which then that fuels political instability, which creates fertile soil for blaming immigrants, blaming leftists, blaming rightists. It becomes a fertile soil for the blame game.
So let's move on to the next point. Matt Stoller then tweets out, probably the most important policy change I worked on was an audit of the Fed's emergency lending authority in 2010. The Fed is deeply political. It's just that Fed officials and their network is hostile to democracy. Now, do they? So he said he worked on the audit of the Fed's emergency lending. You hear a lot of people say that we need to audit the Fed. Ron Paul, what does that mean, and what would be the outcome of that, and why don't they do it?
So what that means is, so right now, when the Federal Reserve, so remember, you talk about the $4.2 trillion, right, in the stimulus bill, but then there's the additional $2 trillion that was up just from the Federal Reserve to support liquidity in the financial markets. So when they talk about the Federal Reserve putting up $1 trillion, $2 trillion, any trillion to support so-called liquidity in the financial markets, that involves the Federal Reserve buying those bonds we talked about. So they're buying the corporate bonds, they're buying municipal bonds. Remember that conversation you and I had a couple of weeks ago?
Right.
And so auditing the Fed would, in essence, would be to go through the Federal Reserve and see which bonds did you buy, what's the default rate on the bonds that you paid for, and how much did you pay for them? Right? It's basically auditing who are you giving money to, and what collateral are you taking for the money you are giving.
So is there a process in place to audit that right now? Do you know?
Absolutely not. No, come on.
And so they're never
crazy.
And so that's what Ron Paul's always.
That's what Ron Paul's always talking about, which is the Federal Reserve is giving money away to everybody that they buy these bonds from, but nobody knows what they're buying, what they're paying, or what's in those bonds.
Okay, so let's move on. This brings me
if you were to audit it, you would then see and you would find things that you didn't like, and it would be offensive.
Right.
But there wouldn't be anything that you could do about it. And in the short term, as long as the dollar is the reserve currency, it doesn't really matter.
Okay, it will when it's not, though. So
That's right.
Let's move on. That's right. Let's move on to the next tweet by Matt Stoller. He says, ultimately, political independence for the Fed is just code for aristocracy. We can't avoid doing politics in a democracy. And if we choose to cut ourselves out of doing politics, all we are doing is choosing to let polite financial dictatorship run our country. So do you agree with that? Ultimately, political independence for the Fed?
Yeah.
So that's just code for an aristocracy? Because now the Fed doesn't have any oversight. There's no auditing. They get to print money, spend money, and there's absolutely nothing we can do about it?
That's right. What's the problem? Not everybody is equal, Jimmy. You have the people that are there to suffer and support society. And then you have those who own things who decide policy and who owns things. And then you have foolish politicians like the leftists who run around claiming that they're working for the oppressed. But when they actually have an opportunity to intervene politically on behalf of not just the oppressed, but on behalf of what would anything remotely resembling justice, they openly choose not to do so, as they just did. So here's one more. Let me read this one to you. Some changes. One, the first change, only half the governors who make monetary policy decisions can be millionaires. 2, transcripts of meetings where Fed governors make decisions are public within 6 months. And 3, all Fed bank branches are part of the government. 4, cut the Fed's terms to 4 years. So he's talking about governors who sit on the Fed. They call them governors? Yeah.
So what do you think about his first? He says only half the governors who make
So
money.
you're saying these are some reforms of the Federal Reserve that Matt is advocating?
Yes. The first one is that only half the governors can be millionaires.
Can be rich.
Yeah. And then 2, they have to make the transcripts of the meeting where Fed governors make decisions public within 6 months. 3, would that make a difference? Those first two, would those make a difference?
I mean, I'm sure it would make some difference. I mean, really, what Matt is advocating for is, one, a more diverse social class for whoever's working in the Federal Reserve, and 2, some sense of more accountability for the Federal Reserve. Both of which I think are logical on his part and admirable, but I suspect pointless.
How is it that the Fed is not part of the government?
How is it? It was legislated to not be part of the government in the 1930s. That's how.
Oh, okay.
It was a policy decision in the Depression or after the crash of 29 to remove politics, money, and move money as a policy item into the domain of the elite as opposed to the idiot politicians of America.
And so what do you think has been the result of that?
A belief that the financial system is the most important thing that exists as opposed to the worker or the agricultural. If you go back to the William Jennings Bryan in the 1890s, I learned this from Matt Stoller for that matter. That was a politician who believed that the agricultural economy was the most significant, that the farming and production economy was the most significant thing in the American economy, and that the currency should be reflected in that. What ended up happening to this country is a macro policy decision was made determining that the finance system and the financial economy is the most important part of our economy, more than the agricultural, more than manufacturing and production, or any other piece of the economy. And as a result, you have a lot of financial exploitation in every part of our economy. And ultimately, you now have monopolies, whether it's or near monopolies, that are then profoundly abusive to customers, whether it's the airlines or the cable companies or the political system. Because when you put the financial system as the centerpiece, as the most important thing in your political system, the most valuable financial system is one that is tied to a monopoly.
Wow.
And so it becomes in the interest of the financial system to work to eliminate competition, because it's much better to lend money to a monopoly than to somebody who might lose.
So the way we set up our finance actually increases the potential for monopolies and bad service to the consumers.
Yeah, it creates a culture where the easiest way to make money is to ensure that monopoly and exploit consumers, as opposed to creating value for consumers. And consumers instead of consumers becoming somebody that for whom value must be created, they become somebody from whom they can be taken hostage and value can be extracted.
Right.
But it becomes even more frustrating than that, because you really have two economies. You have this large economy of mass extraction, where whether it's the airlines or the cell phone companies, or the cable companies, are sort of the obvious villains there. And then you have this fight to the death street capitalism that really is more represented by your business, where there is incredible competition for time and attention, for content, where you must provide something of some value to the person's eyeballs in order to get their attention. Unfortunately, the easiest way to do that, as Facebook has discovered, is with really primal lizard brain fear-mongering and manipulation, which is what Facebook has mastered, which is a different issue.
Right.
But
So do you think putting the Fed branches making them part of the government, would that help?
I don't know.
Okay.
I'm not. I'm fairly fatalistic about the whole political universe, as you know, Jimmy.
Yes.
So I think politics is not a place where justice has been or ever will be found.
So, all right. Well, just since I have it prepared, let's just go through it. There's one more. He lists he lists numbers 5 and 6. So 5, he says, put the head of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the Labor Secretary on the Fed board so the interests of consumers and workers are represented. That sounds like a good idea, but that'll probably never happen, right?
Well, yeah, but it sounds logical. Again, Matt's advocating for diversity and accountability, but not as the theatrical version of it that would be done by your standard, leftists, but
Right.
actual functional.
Right.
I mean, Matt's problem is that because he is intimately familiar with the plumbing of the American political system, its mechanics, because of his work for Alan Grayson years ago, and he was actually a Bernie Sanders staffer for years on the looking at monopolies. So Matt really understands, the down and dirty system of how decisions are made and how bills are produced and passed. And so he has very precise ideas about how to influence that system to create more accountability, which is, why some of his reporting and thoughts have value, even if the political system will never advocate for them.
So he's he's saying that the people on the left don't understand finance. And if you don't understand finance in the money world, you're going to get screwed every time. I think that's what he's basically saying. And then he gives some concrete, I didn't know anything about this, right? So, and I think that's what he's talking about, is that people don't, but it's also engineered to make it hard for people to understand also, just like legal speak. They have a language of their own, so it keeps everybody...
Words, the vocabulary.
It keeps everybody out of their business, right? So now they look like a specialist, and nobody else can get in on it because they have the language all to themselves, and that's what finance has done too. And,
But there's not a single thing that you and I have discussed that I don't feel like you've not comprehended completely.
Right. Like for instance...
including the Fed window and trading the bonds and all that jazz.
Right.
I mean, the irony is that this is, with the right words and time, this is anybody can understand this. It's, to your point, it's deliberately obfuscated.
Yes. The difference between an equity investment and a venture capital investment and, all that kind of stuff. And they do that just to confuse you, I think, right? I mean, I know there's differences to all that stuff, but...
right, well, sure, but I mean, the thing is there are and there aren't, right? The thing is, there's so many little worlds of how to invest money, whether it's a loan or an investment. But the totality of lending and investment is still really a distraction from the policy on how money is created at the central bank and distributed into the system, right? When you go to the head of the river, it is distracting to talk about the different shapes of the streams downstream. But what they do is they deliberately talk about things like that to confuse you so that you don't actually understand what's going on at the head of the river, which is the Federal Reserve.
Right. So Matt then goes on and says this is...
But the biggest issue, and that's where Matt is the absence, the refusal of the left to be expert in this subject and have an agenda on it.
Right.
Is a complete and utter abdication of all duty, which is really not even if you expect politicians to do anything other than aggrandize themselves, then it is disappointing to see what the left has done with finance. But when you think of politicians as self-serving hypocrites whose only agenda is their own self-aggrandizement, whether it's conscious or not, then the behavior becomes very logical. The abdication is logical.
Let me just read this to you. He says, anyone who cares about voting rights as anything more than an aesthetic action should also care that voting leads to policy changes. If the Fed is independent, it means that voting doesn't matter. That's kind of a good point, right? I mean, so if we think voting leads to policy changes, but the Fed is separate from government and independent, there's no way we could ever affect the Fed's policies by voting, right?
Absolutely true. However, you have two bad alternatives. One, you have the aristocracy running the central bank now. Or two, you have Donald Trump or Barack Obama or George W. Bush or Bill Clinton manipulating the supply of money for their own short-term political agenda. Both of those options are terrible. Right?
Yes.
So the reason they gave the Federal Reserve to the aristocracy, as opposed to allowing the whipsaw of American politics, 4 years here, 4 years there, this rapacious maniac thief, no, this rapacious maniac thief, no, I want this senile rapist. You're like, no, I prefer this senile rapist. Allowing that system to decide who controls the money supply was deemed to be worse than simply allowing aristocrats from New York and San Francisco to do it.
Yeah, I mean both bad systems, I would say.
That's the theme.
So people, here's his last tweet. He says, in case anyone cares, Fed's Monetary Policy Setting Committee has 5 members who are neither appointed by the president nor confirmed by the Senate, which is unconstitutional. There are 5 governors appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. And then he lists the committee members. I never heard of one of these guys, and they're the ones really running the country. Never heard of one of them. The committee members for the Fed. Never heard of them. And I'll just end with this quote.
Those are your aristocrats.
Yes, these are them. Jerome Powell, the Board of Governors chairman. John C. Williams, vice chairman. Richard Clarida. Neil Kashkari's on there. I know him. Loretta J. Mester. Randall Quarles. So yeah, those are your aristocrats. Those are, and here's what Ezra Klein actually tweeted this out. He says, one of the weirdest and worst asymmetries in policy right now is that banks and big corporations can get fast, basically unlimited help from the Fed, while small biz and individual help is limited and slowed by congressional process and dysfunction. I'll just go back and say, when he says one of the weirdest and worst asymmetries in policy right now is that banks and big corporations get money fast, it's not right now. It's been that way forever, Ezra. Thanks for waking up. What do you say to that?
And that's the Cantillon effect, by the way.
Yes, right.
Right, big, fast money for a few people right now, and small, slow money for everybody else later.
So he recommends the ideas for what the Fed could do right now is he says, I would co-sign Congress giving the Fed the statutory authority to offer, quote unquote, helicopter money to individuals when the economy warrants it. No reason only banks should have this fast track. What do you say to that idea that the Fed, that the Congress give the Fed the ability to give everybody money, not just banks?
Yeah, I mean, I was advocating that in 2009.
Oh, really?
Okay.
Yeah, if you're going to open up the money printers, the only way you can reasonably do it is make it universally available, or don't do it. But they do it selectively for the benefit of those who are friends with the aristocrats, which is why you ended up with Donald Trump as your president in the first place, because people knew they got screwed and they were willing to go with a destroyer, rapist maniac was a logical, preferable alternative.
Actually, logical.
After the betrayal of Obama and the central banks in 8, 9, 10.
All right. This is I again appreciate your insight. Anything? I'm way past my 4:30 interview. What? Anything you want to leave us with?
No, I'll let you go. But I would just say, because it's easy to be horrified as you dig through the rotting flesh of the American political system. But don't let that consume your mind to the point that you fail to see the potential that exists in the actual human beings in this country who are very engaged in a creative way, whether it's in our hospitals, whether it's in entertainment, whether it's in innovation and science. There are so many smart, hardworking, interesting humans. And yes, they're being overwhelmed by the carcass of American politics, but that carcass is a global carcass, and the American people are remarkably capable of being creative, and I don't want you to underestimate that, because that's really where I think we're more likely to find ourselves in a healthier society because of working around the American political system than because of any change in the American political system.
Okay. All right. Let's work around it. Dylan Radigan from Tasty Trade. Tell people about your podcast.
I'm Tom Sosnoff and I every Wednesday, Truth or Skepticism, have a version of the conversation you and I are having but entirely devoted to finance, although we've been talking obviously about the pandemic. But Wednesdays at Tasty Trade, Tom and I do our thing.
What's the URL for people to find that?
Just tastytrade.com.
Okay, tastytrade.com, Dylan Radigan's podcast. Everybody check it out. Dylan, thanks for being our guest, and thanks for the info. Hope to talk to you again soon.
It's always nice to be able to talk to you guys. Have a good weekend, okay?
Okay, you too. Bye-bye.
Happy birthday.
All right, bye-bye.
Oh, is it his birthday?
Hey, thank you.
Oh.
All right, bye.
Bye.
Hey, this is the part where I tell you where our live shows are, but there aren't any. And then I would tell you to go join our premium, but nobody has a fucking job. So why don't you just enjoy the video?